Salam, peace be upon you. My name is Mohammed Layiq Sediqi, the father of Holophase. Part 17, the Triunity as Projections. Remember the language we are learning. There is one field, phi, the holophase, one continuous cyclic movement from which all of reality unfolds. When phi begins to change, its first derivatives appear, and with them, the three dimensions show themselves at once. Time as omega, space as k, and motion as v, built from both. Every higher derivative is a finer question about how phi changes, and each one casts three shadows together: a time shadow, a space shadow, and a motion shadow. These echoes mix and weave into one another, forming the patterns we call fields, particles, bodies, thoughts, and worlds. In this picture, everything that exists is a living tapestry of phi, endlessly echoing through its derivatives and their dimensional shadows. Today, we listen to just one of those echoes. We are in Episode 8, the pure abstract language. We are now in Book 8.5, exploring abstract semantics, how meaning can arise entirely inside the holophase language, even before we point to any outside world. In the last part, we saw that meaning lives in the internal relations between symbols, in how phi, omega, k, curvature, sigma, winding, and holonomy constrain and support each other. We discovered that the language of phi is already a self-signifying web. It carries its own internal sense before it is ever attached to clocks, rulers, particles, or measurements. Today, we turn to the deepest internal relation of all. From the very beginning of our journey, we have spoken of three echoes of every structure: a time echo, a space echo, and a motion echo. We have talked about temporal patterns, spatial shapes, and flows of motion. Up to now, we have treated these as three aspects that always travel together. Today, we ask a sharper question. What exactly is the relationship? Are they three different ingredients or three views of one underlying structure? In this part, we reveal what I call the tri-unity. The insight that time, space, and motion are not separate substances, but three projections of one semantic crystal. To feel this, let us begin with a simple image. Imagine you are holding a beautifully cut crystal in your hand. Its interior is full of planes and edges, all part of a single, unified structure. You shine a light on it from one side, and on the wall appears a square-shaped shadow. You turn the crystal a little and shine again. This time, the shadow looks hexagonal. You turn the crystal once more, and the shadow becomes a star-like pattern. The crystal has not changed, only the angle of illumination has changed. What has happened is that one object has produced three very different shadows, depending on how you look at it. In the holophase language, phi and its full tower of derivatives are like that crystal. The entire relational structure, all the ways phi can change, and all the constraints that link those changes, is one unified object. Time, space, and motion are like three different shadows cast by that object. There are three ways of reading the same underlying structure. We can name these three projections more carefully. The first projection is the sequence view. This is the view that asks, what comes before what? How does this pattern unfold as we move along a direction we call time? When we look through this lens, omega, the time derivative of phi, comes to the foreground. Alpha, the change of omega, follows behind it. Higher time derivatives become the grammar of rhythm, acceleration, and modulation. This projection produces what we experience as temporal stories: beginnings, middles, endings. The second projection is the coexistence view. This view asks, what sits next to what? How are different values of phi arranged side by side? When we look through this lens, k, the spatial gradient of phi, becomes central. Curvature, divergence, and other spatial derivatives describe texture, shape, and geometry. This projection produces what we experience as spatial layout: near and far, left and right, dense and sparse. The third projection is the transformation view. This view asks, How does one arrangement become another? What is the path of change that connects one configuration to the next? When we look through this lens, velocity v, built in simple cases from omega and k together, becomes primary. It describes the mapping from one arrangement to another as time passes. This projection produces what we experience as motion, trajectories, flows, and transformations. The important point is that the underlying crystal is one. The derivatives of phi do not live in three separate boxes labeled time, space, and motion. They live in one unified structure. The triunity says that time, space, and motion are three consistent ways of projecting this one structure, three different shadows cast by the same object. In our language metaphor, you can think of these three projections as three grammatical voices. Imagine that you want to describe a journey from your home to a distant town. In the sequential voice, you speak in terms of events. I woke up, I prepared, I left home, I traveled, I arrived. In the coexistential voice, you describe the scenery. My home lay in a valley, mountains rose on the horizon, a river wound along the road, the town sat on a hill. In the transformational voice, you describe the route itself. My path traced a curve along the river, crossed a bridge, climbed a slope, and spiraled into the town square. These are not three separate journeys. They are three ways of telling the same story. The Holophase language has this built in from the start. Any pattern in phi can be spoken about in these three voices, as a sequence, as a configuration, and as a transformation. The triunity names this simple but powerful fact. The one language has three fundamental interpretive phases. Let us now look more closely at each phase and see how it arises from the same underlying relational web. First, the sequence projection. At the purely abstract level, we do not yet assume clocks or physical time. We simply pick out one direction along which we ask, what happens if we move a little in this direction? Omega is defined as the rate of change of phi along that direction. When omega is 0, phi is constant in that direction. When omega is non-zero, phi is shifting. If we look again and ask how omega itself changes along the same direction, we meet alpha, the second derivative, and so on. Even before we interpret this direction as time, we can see that there is a set of relations that describe ordering, repetition, growth, decay, and oscillation along a chosen axis. That is all we need at this level to talk about a sequence view. Second, the coexistence projection. Again, at the abstract level, we do not yet assume three-dimensional physical space. We simply consider directions along which we can step sideways and ask, how does phi change as we move across this manifold? The gradient k measures the change of phi from point to point. Curvature measures how quickly that gradient itself changes and in what way. Divergence tells us whether values are spreading out or concentrating in a region. Curl tells us how they twist. Together, these relations describe patterns of adjacency and structure. That is all we need at this level to talk about a coexistence view. Third, the transformation projection. Here we look at how sequences and coexistences interact. If we have a pattern across the manifold, and we also know how it changes along our sequence direction, we can ask, what motion of the pattern would keep certain relations stable? In simple wave-like cases, we find that a crest of constant phase moves so that the change in time balances the change in space, giving us a velocity proportional to omega divided by k. More generally, we can describe flows, mappings that carry one configuration into another consistently over the sequence direction. This gives us a well-defined notion of a trajectory or evolution rule. That is all we need to talk about a transformation view. The triunity says something very strong. These three views are not optional add-ons. They are built into the very way derivatives relate to each other. If we have derivatives at all, if we can speak of change along directions and across manifolds, then the sequence, coexistence, and transformation projections are already hiding inside the structure. We can now ask, Where does the triunity sit in the master tree? It is not a single branch labeled triunity. Rather, it is like having three suns shining on the same tree from three different angles. The tree itself, phi and its derivative tau, is one. But when the three suns shine, we get three different patterns of shadow on the ground. One shadow emphasizes the vertical height of the tree. Another emphasizes its horizontal spread. A third emphasizes the twisting of its branches. The shadows are not the tree, but they reveal complementary aspects of its form. In the same way, the triunity tells us that if we look at the same derivative structure from the standpoint of sequence, coexistence, or transformation, we will see three different but consistent pictures. This has an important consequence. Any structure we define in the Holophase language must, in principle, be readable in all three projections. If we define a new derivative or a new constraint, we should be able to ask, what is its time echo, its space echo, and its motion echo? If we cannot, the structure is incomplete. It is like describing a character in a story only by their actions and never by where they are or how they change over time. The triunity is also the binding principle behind many of the equations we write. When a constraint relates omega and k, or curvature and motion, it is often enforcing the consistency of different projections of the same underlying pattern. For example, if a relation says that a certain combination of time and space derivatives must vanish, it can be read as saying, the sequential description and the coexistence description are two faces of one deeper structure. Therefore, they cannot contradict each other. To deepen this understanding, let us look again at the triunity through the lens of internal semantics. In the last part, we learned that meaning can exist purely in the web of relations between symbols, even before those symbols point to anything outside. The triunity is the most important example of such a relation. It tells us that the very same derivative structure can be organized into three complementary stories. Inside the language, without mentioning clocks or rulers, we can already distinguish change along a direction, variation across a manifold, and maps that carry one pattern into another. These are semantic roles. They are the earliest shadows of what will later become time, space, and motion in a physical world. Seen this way, the triunity is like a set of three lenses permanently mounted on the same camera. You cannot remove them, but you can decide which one you are currently looking through. The Holophase language comes with these lenses built in. When you place a pattern of phi in front of the language can always ask, how does this pattern look if I track its ordering? How does this pattern look if I track its arrangement? How does this pattern look if I track its transformation? The answers are different, but they are answers about the same underlying object. We can also view the triunity as a constraint on what kinds of languages are allowed to describe a universe like ours. Suppose you tried to build a language in which you could talk about sequences, but there was no way to talk about coexistence. You could say, this happened, then that happened, but you could never meaningfully say, these two things are present together. That language would be unable to describe even the simplest experience of a room in which multiple objects sit at once. Conversely, if you built a language that could only talk about coexistence, this is next to that, but could never talk about change or order, it could not express the simplest notion of a process or a story. And if you try to talk about motion without any concept of ordered states or coexisting configurations, motion would collapse into nonsense. The Holophase language refuses these impoverished options. By its very structure, it insists that any pattern worth talking about must be readable as a sequence, a coexistence, and a transformation at once. This insistence is what we are naming when we speak of triunity. Let us now add another layer: stability and falsifiability. The triunity is not just a poetic way of speaking, it is a structural claim about how reality can be consistently described. It says, whenever we find a lawful pattern in the universe, we should be able to describe it in terms of a coherent time story, a coherent space story, and a coherent motion story that all fit together as three projections of one law. Think of the simple law of a harmonic oscillator, a mass on a spring. In the time story, The displacement oscillates back and forth with a certain frequency. In the space story, if you were to plot displacement against velocity, you would see a closed loop, a circle or an ellipse in phase space. In the motion story, you have a rule that tells you how position and velocity at one moment map into position and velocity a short time later. 3 stories, 1 law. If someone wrote down a supposed law of motion that made sense as a time story but produced impossible loops in phase space, we would reject it as inconsistent. The triunity would have caught the error. Now imagine a very different scale, the large-scale structure of the universe. Cosmologists describe it with equations that specify how the universe expands in time, how matter and radiation are distributed in space, and how galaxies and clusters move relative to each other. Again, the law is one, the projections are three. If observations forced us into a picture where the time evolution, the spatial distribution, and the motions of galaxies could not be derived from a single underlying relation, we would know that something is deeply wrong with our framework. This brings us to a falsifiability test for the triunity. The test is not a single experiment, but a style of checking consistency across domains. Whenever a new theory is proposed, we can ask, does it treat time, space, and motion as aspects of one structure or as disconnected pieces? Do its equations allow a unified reading in which the three projections are bound together, or does it smuggle in three unrelated clocks, three unrelated spaces, and three unrelated motion rules? If over time our most successful theories continue to exhibit this unity, if they keep confirming that time, space, and motion are interdependent within a single geometric or algebraic framework, then the triunity earns more credibility. If one day our best confirmed theory requires us to break that unity in a fundamental and non-negotiable way, then the triunity has encountered its limit. Either way, the claim is clear and answerable. Are the three faces still faces of one thing, or have they been torn apart? Let us also look at the triunity across different levels of human experience, so that it becomes something you can feel rather than only think about. At the level of daily life, consider cooking a meal. The sequence view is the recipe. First chop, then heat the oil, then add ingredients, then simmer. The coexistence view is the layout, where the ingredients are on the table, how the kitchen is arranged, where the heat source is. The transformation view is the actual cooking, the change from raw to cooked, from separate ingredients to mixed flavor. When you succeed in cooking, it is because these three are harmonious. The timing fits the layout, and the transformations respect both. At the level of society, consider a city. The sequence view is its history: founding, growth, crises, rebuilding. The coexistence view is its map: neighborhoods, transport lines, green spaces, dense centers, quiet edges. The transformation view is its daily flow: traffic patterns, migration of people, circulation of goods and information. Urban planners who ignore any one of these projections usually fail. A plan that looks good on the map but ignores historical sequence or actual flows will not work. Again, the triunity is not an abstract luxury. It is a practical lens for understanding complex systems. At the level of inner life, consider a mood or a belief. The sequence view is how it arises and fades, how it repeats, how it is triggered. The coexistence view is what it lives alongside in your mind: other thoughts, memories, bodily sensations. The transformation view is how it shapes your actions, and how those actions in turn reshape the mood or belief. Seeing all three can turn vague self-awareness into a precise understanding of your own patterns. By training yourself to see in this way, you are aligning your perception with the deep structure of the Holophase language. You are effectively learning to think in triunity. Before we close, it is important to address one more subtlety. When we say that time, space, and motion are projections, we do not mean that they are illusions or that they can be explained away. A shadow is not the full three-dimensional object, but it is real as a shadow. It has shape, length, orientation. You can measure it. You can use it to tell the time on a sundial. In the same way, the temporal, spatial, and motional aspects of reality are real as aspects. They can be measured, modeled, and used to make predictions. The triunity simply warns us not to treat them as three independent bricks out of which the universe is built. Instead, it invites us to see them as three consistent ways that one deeper structure appears. To keep all of this concrete, let us look at a few examples. Consider a falling leaf. In the sequence projection, you see a timeline. The moment the leaf detaches, the stages of its fluttering descent, the moment it touches the ground. In the coexistence projection, you see its position relative to the branch, the air currents, the ground, and other leaves around it. You see the shape of its path as a line in space. In the transformation projection, you see a rule: gravity pulling down, air resistance pushing up, chaotic eddies pushing sideways, all combining into a particular curved trajectory. One event, three readings. If you try to describe the leaf using only time, something happened, then something else, without any spatial pattern, you would be missing the story. If you try to describe only where it was, as if frozen, ignoring its sequence and its path, you would also be missing the story. The real understanding lives in the unity of all three. Consider a conversation between two people. In the sequence view, you have the order of words and sentences, the pauses, the interruptions. In the coexistence view, you have the network of meanings present at any moment: shared background knowledge, emotional context, the physical setting. In the transformation view, you have the flow of understanding, the way misunderstandings are corrected, the way agreement is reached or disagreement deepens. Again, the conversation is one, but you can project it onto these three axes and gain different insights. Consider a piece of music. The sequence view is obvious, the progression of notes in time. The coexistence view lives in the score, where all the instrument's parts are written on the page at once, forming harmonies and textures. The transformation view appears in the performance, where the conductor and musicians turn the static score into a living flow. When you listen deeply, you are unconsciously integrating all three. You feel the present chord, coexistence, remember the past motifs and anticipate the future, sequence, and ride the dynamic swell of sound, transformation. In each of these examples, the triunity is not an abstract doctrine. It is a way of noticing something you already experience. The holophase language simply gives that noticing a precise structural home. It tells you that sequence, coexistence, and transformation are three systematic projections of one field and its derivatives. We now return to phi itself. The triunity does not multiply entities. We are not saying that there are three fields or three kinds of stuff. We are saying there is one field, phi, living on a manifold, taking values on a circle, equipped with an infinite hierarchy of derivatives. This one field has a rich internal relational structure. When we, as part of that structure, step back and ask, in how many fundamentally different ways can this be read? We find three great axes of interpretation: sequence, coexistence, and transformation. Time, space, and motion are those three axes, seen from the inside. Remember, everything we have talked about is still just one field, phi, and its derivatives. The single language the universe uses to write every story. In Episode 8, we are examining this language in its pure abstract form, before it writes any particular world. In earlier parts of this episode, we built the alphabet, the grammar, the topology, and the internal semantics. In this part, we have seen that the three familiar dimensions of our experience are not separate substances, but three projections of a single relational crystal. If you want to see the more formal side of this triunity, how the decomposition of derivatives into temporal, spatial, and mixed components can be written down precisely, you can search for Holophase on Zenodo. There you will find the scientific papers that this audio journey is built on. In the next part, we will explore how certain quadratic combinations of derivatives, such as omega squared and the squared magnitude of k, naturally arise as measures of intensity along these projections. These will become, in later episodes, the seeds of what we call energy, not as a substance, but as a tally of how strongly phi is changing in each aspect. For now, as you move through your day, try a simple exercise. Whenever you notice something happening, pause and ask yourself three questions. What is the sequence here? What is the pattern of coexistence? What is the transformation that links them? Let your mind gently hold all three at once. In doing so, you are beginning to see with the triune vision of the holophase. One field, three faces, endlessly unfolding. As you practice this, you're not adding anything artificial to reality. You are simply allowing the single holophase tapestry to show you more of itself, revealing its story as sequence, as pattern, and as flow all at once. This triune seeing is the beginning of fluency. Salam, and peace be upon you.